Welcome everyone. This is the most important and the biggest video on my channel so far. And for this we're going to look at the 2018 League of Legends World Championship and why it was a monumental game changer. It's in fact the biggest game changer in the modern history of the game, as I would argue. And we're going to go about this as follows. We're going to first look at the beforehand situation, what kind of place in the history of League we were at that point. Then we're going to look at the events that unfolded at the tournament and how people reacted to them as it happened. And then, most importantly, we're going to evaluate the opinions people had at the time and people might still hold today about what actually happened at that tournament and why it was such a big game changer and what exactly changed with this tournament taking place. That being said, let's just dive right into it. Before the tournament, we were in a place and time where Korea was thought to be unbeatable and untouchable in League of Legends. They had won every World Championship ever since Season 3, and they had only ever lost once at MSI under sort of shady circumstances, with Faker not playing all the games. But in general, Korea was going to win every World Championship and there was no way around it. Wildcard regions had never done anything at Worlds before this. There were of course some notable exceptions to this rule, some notable teams taking single games. I very much recommend G-Base video on the history of wildcard teams at World Championships, and especially ANX obviously made a big run in 2016, it must have been, yeah. But in general, wildcard regions just didn't do shit at the tournament, and they were still patiently waiting to, get a breakout performance. People rooting for the little guy at a World Championship were mostly, and I'm talking about the West here, were mostly rooting for Korea's number 3 seed, because of course they would have preferred a Western team winning Worlds, but at this point it was so outlandish a thought for Western team to win Worlds in 2016-17. Most people just rooted for the outsider Asian teams, as it were, and hoped they could maybe upset SKT or the big name Koreans that were at the tournament at the time, because they just thought there was no way that their favorite teams were gonna win anything. In fact, I remember back to Season 5 World Championships where I attended the final in Berlin, and the people there overwhelmingly were rooting for Coup Tigers, because most of the fans there in fact hadn't watched a game of LCK in that year. Those were European fans, and they just rooted for the little guy, as were the outsider Korean team that were not SKT in that case. It was very much a mindset of, if I can't win Worlds, then at least I don't want those big name favorite Koreans who win it every time to win it. Completely disregarding that the other Korean team were also just 5 Korean players that they had never watched a game of, but we'll put that aside. Western teams making semis was thought to be the pinnacle of their performance. Western team had never advanced past semis ever since Season 3, and in previous years, especially 2015 again, where Europe had that monster performance with 2 very strong teams in Origin and Fnatic. 2015 Fnatic were the ones who went flawlessly in the summer split and didn't lose a single game. And even those, they couldn't advance past the semis because the Koreans would just 3-0 slap them. As soon as it came to a best of 5 versus a Korean team, you were pretty much doomed. And that was consensus in the community. Many people argued, or still argue to this day, that in fact after Season 7 Worlds, when Misfits took SKT to 5 games, that the gap had been closed at that point, or at least had narrowed down. But in fact, most of the analysts, or people who actually knew what they were looking at the time, it was quite clear that the gap wasn't closed at all. On the one hand, Misfits surely set a good example on how one could beat Korean teams, or teams that were straight up better than your team, by sticking to one's strength rather than the meta, which would play a big part in Europe defeating Korean teams or just straight up better teams in Season 8 Worlds. But SKT, you could make an argument for them being the worst Korean team at the Season 7 World Championship. They got slapped and smacked by Samsung in the finals, so it wasn't really as big of a deal as it first seemed. And also, which most people seem to forget, Sure, it went to 5 games, but Misfits lost the series. After all, the result was no different than any other best of 5 between Korean and European teams at Worlds to that point. So sure, they came close and put up a respectable performance, but it was a loss after all, and thus the gap had not at all been closed before Season 8 Worlds. And the European results that would follow at that tournament were surely the groundbreaking ones, whereas the Misfits best of 5 could at best be described as an indicator of where the needle was moving. RNG and Fnatic, though, in 2018 were very much exceptions to that rule. RNG had won the MSI in that year, and they had looked like the strongest team in the world all throughout the year. Both splits in China had been won by them, and MSI, as I said, very convincingly. And Fnatic in Europe looked very exceptional as well. They had Caps in peak form. They just slapped everyone in Europe. Clean year for them as well, although they didn't come close to that flawless regular season record of 2015. But many people were of the opinion that this was the best Western team of all time. I remember Thorin and Lokodoko actually having a show at the time, ranking the best Western teams of all time. And Thorin actually made the point in that video that he said Fnatic 2018 before the tournament. He stated they would make the finals, and they ended up doing so. So props to him for that. And history did prove him right, as he suggested. In general, though, RNG and Fnatic, those were the only 2 teams at the tournament who were considered to have a chance against the Koreans. And many actually said that RNG were the favorites this time around and not the Koreans. And the Koreans we're talking about in this case is KT Roaster. That was the big name Korean super team. It was SMAP, it was Score, it was Yukon, it was Deft, it was Mada. And those 5 players are legendary Korean players. Yukon, debatably so, but the other 4 legendary Korean players. You could make a case for those players, for all of those players, to be the best in their role of all time. SMAP, definitely, most people put him as the best top laner of all time, especially at that point in time where the Shy hadn't yet broken out. And yeah, so this was pretty much the top of the field. RNG being considered the favorites alongside KT. It really only came down to whether you were a Korean or a Chinese League fan at this point in time. Most people, still to this day in League of Legends, only analyze one region, either Korea or China, very in depth. And in the West, it's a little different since we're only playing best of ones here and cultural reasons. So many people watch LEC and LCS, but for the Eastern regions, today, just as 3 years ago back then, people really only watched China or Korea very in depth. And those few people who actually watched both regions made some very good points at this Worlds, as we will see later on. So yeah, the expert opinion on average was RNG and KT tied for first, tied for favorites, and Fnatic just slightly below them. Because yeah, as I said, Western teams winning Worlds was still a big taboo word, and people wouldn't have people who were confident enough to predict such a thing would catch very much flack afterwards when the Western team inevitably lost, so many people thought. Okay, yeah, RNG had looked like the best team at MSI, but was considered by Westerners to be an outlier from China, just like Fnatic was an outlier from Europe. So they thought, yeah, that's a very strong team from that region, but it's not indicative of the overall strength of China. IG, as well from China, had a bonkers regular season record, like ridiculous best of 3 record, but they lost in playoffs to RNG in spring and summer, I do believe so. And the Chinese analysts were very high on them. They gave IG a lot of credit and suggested that they might be able to do some damage in the tournament. Many other people wouldn't though, so only the Chinese people who had religiously watched the region throughout the year put them in the club of the top 4 teams in the tournament. Of course, the ignorant Western fans didn't even know half the players from that team before the tournament. That would change rapidly though. But yeah, so that was pretty much the field for the top of the standings. Also, there was a huge shift in meta, and this is the key point, gameplay-wise, obviously, what changed about this World Championship. With the many changes that have been debated up and down, such as removal of Sidestone, Um, the previously Korean dominated vision meta and playing safe, playing for scaling, or all of that um, was very much outdated at this point in time, and people didn't really know that before the tournament started, that this would prove to be an insurmountable issue for the Korean teams. Let's dive into the tournament then. So this was the mindset before the tournament. Many people thought if Fnatic and RNG couldn't do it, it would for sure be one of the three Korean teams. I touched on KT Rolster being the super team, the #1 seed from Korea, favorite for the tournament, but there was also a Freak of Freaks, decent Korean team, nothing special, and Genji, who were the defending world champions actually at this point in time. Right, so in play-ins, it started out very heated. All the major regions lost at least one game, which was unheard of until this point in time. People were starting to get nervous and asking questions such as, are the minor regions catching up to us? Or is it maybe that just NA and EU are bad regions for struggling in play-ins? C9 in particular went to 5 games against Gambit, actually from Russia, to make it out of play-ins, and only, in the 5th game could they finally manage to defeat them. Every major league team lost a game in this play-ins, and that's why many people thought that either the minor regions had caught up, or the third seeds of the major regions were just bad teams. Although later on, we need to keep this in mind, G2 and C9 would both make semis from play-ins, which is a ridiculous thing to consider. Those third seeds of the regions would go on to make top 4 at the tournament eventually. In group stage then, I was actually there on the floor in Busan, and yeah, I have proof of this. I have the Fnatic jersey that I bought at the event actually, or at the time the event took place in Korea, and I was actually on the floor. Many Korean, many Chinese fans there. Actually, the Chinese were the most organized and the most loud, and they had the merch. Sale going on outside the arena. They were really passionate about their teams. And so let's dive into what actually happened in groups. On the first day, I remember this very vividly. Europe beat Korean teams twice. It was, of course, only best of ones, but Vitality beat Genji, the defending world champions, and G2 beat a Freak of Freaks, actually, playing a beautiful split push style with Camille top from Wonder, I believe. I have very vivid memories of those games still in my head to this day, and it was a very, very weird feeling all throughout the day. I was just like high all the time, and the Korean fans who attended the event, they couldn't believe it. It was insane to them. There were only a couple of Western fans in the arena. It wasn't a big arena either, the Bexco Auditorium, but all those Asian fans, that they were very much baffled by the results of that first day. I mean, it was only day 1, and of course, big teams tend to drop 1 or 2 best of ones in group stages, but you could already sense that those Western teams could do some damage at this tournament. Going through the rest of the group stage, upsets kept happening, although most of the favorites ended up prevailing, and we'll just have a look at the final day of each of the 4 groups. I'll pull up the groups real quick for us to evaluate. So this is Group B. Group B was thought to be the group of death, with the best team RNG in the tournament, and the defending world champions in Genji being in there, and Genji ended up completely bombing out of that group stage. They didn't find a footing in the tournament, and they got just completely swept. They only won 1 game in the group stage against Cloud9, 0-2 versus fucking Vitality from Europe, who were by no means an elite team, and 0-2 against RNG, which is more excusable. Yeah, Vitality, as I said, they were complete coin flippers. They went 2-0 versus Genji. One iconic moment in that matchup being Jizuke's echo diving Crown Syndra under the top tier 2 tower. And I believe this is the primary reason why Jizuke is regarded highly to this day in the Western leagues for his echo play. He really made a mark at that tournament. But they ended up, Vitality did, going 0-2 against Cloud9, which illustrates quite perfectly their coin flippiness. Neither Vitality, nor Cloud9, nor Genji were elite teams at this tournament. And yeah, the games just went wild. 0-2, 2-0s here and there. But also Vitality ended up taking a game of RNG with Attila playing Draven. And it was on that final day that it started looking very good for Vitality, but then as they lost to Cloud9, they fell behind in that group, and Cloud9 ended up taking the second seed. They actually went 3-0, Cloud9 did, on the last day, which is very unheard of for NA teams to do, to secure tie for first place, which the tiebreaker, they lost narrowly to RNG, but you could already sense at this point in time that RNG, although they took first in the group, were not looking as superior as you would have expected. And some people thought they were maybe sandbagging, they were not playing to the fullest yet, they were still adjusting to the tournament meta or something like that. But to be honest, if we look back at it now, they didn't really look special in that group stage. They just looked like a better team than the other three, but not like a great team who played to the meta. They were still very much dependent on their bot lane, which ended up being a downfall of all the bot lane oriented teams of that tournament. Another notable thing from the last day of the Group B was Yamato Cannon, the coach of Vitality, giving an iconic speech about sticking to one's identity, which would prove instrumental to the success of every single team pretty much that went deep in the tournament, as opposed to sticking to what was thought to be the superior meta of the time. RNG and KT both were very much bottom oriented teams, and they were considered to be the best beforehand, but Yamato Cannon urged everybody to play, to not look at what the big teams are doing, but to play like my style, and very much put that idea forward. Now let's move on to Group A. The final day of Group A, there's not very much to be said about this. In this group, everybody just beat everyone. Flashwolves, G2, and the Freaker Freaks all looked very good in single games, having some amazing performances, but then again very vulnerable in other games. G2 ended up going 1-1 in this group against all three teams, and only got a tie in fact with Flashwolves after they lost their last game to Fengbu Buffalo, which was the wildcard team in this group. And no team in this group really looked like a top contender. They were all, as I said, great in some games, but then again vulnerable and outright bad in some other games. So Afrika Freaks, unsurprisingly as the Korean team, moved out of the group in first place, and G2 snuck out in second place, looking inspiring in some wins, but not like an elite team at all. In Group C, there's really, again, not much to be said. KT dominated the group, looking exceptional in many games. I vividly remember Marta's Gragas bending over Jensen's LeBlanc in mid lane, completely outplaying him. And even still at this 2018 tournament, when I watched Marta live in the arena, I just felt inspired by his play. He was such a generational player, and you could really see that in many of his games. EDG in this group lost the game to Team Liquid on the last day, but it didn't matter since they got a win of KT on the last game as well. So Team Liquid departed in third place, and poor little Rich TL again didn't get out of groups. This group overall was relatively clear-cut. KT were the superior team, they looked like the favorites they were supposed to be, and EDG were just an okay team from China who took care of worse teams usually, but didn't look like they were going to contest the elite teams of the tournament either. For Group D, this was the critical group of the tournament, the most exciting one, and this group was just Fnatic and IG stomping everyone, but as both of those teams ended up going to finals, this group stage already told you a lot about how the tournament would look. It was only that people couldn't know that at that point in time. 100 Thieves and G-Rex didn't do anything in this group, looked very much not world-class level. Fnatic, having lost in the first matchup against IG, end up upsetting them twice in a row in the final day, and I can only speak from my own experience in the arena with all those Korean and Chinese fans there, and like a dozen of European fans. We all ended up watching that last game together, and it was Fnatic against IG. They win the first time, they get the tiebreaker, they win the second time. That was such an ecstatic moment in the tournament. It was an insane feeling that I can really not describe at all. You had to be there. It was incredible. IG had looked very much unbeatable before that. Rookie and the Shy just shit on every lane matchup they got, and Fnatic winning twice against them really inspired the European fans. And at that point in time, remember, KT had looked strong, okay, but RNG hadn't looked as strong as people had expected. And Fnatic managing to, at this point in time, look stronger than the second seed from China very much opened up a possibility for them to, go to the finals in this tournament or maybe win it all, depending on how consistently they could pull up such performances as the two wins against IG. Remember, in the first game against IG, they had fielded Soas in the top lane, but people really thought that with Buipo in the top lane, they could beat anyone, and that was more or less the case at this point in time. For those two games, especially iconic Broxah Lee Sin performance in game 1, and Reckless just outperformed Jackie Love in the tiebreaker game. Just a bunch of Fnatic players outplaying their opponents, except Caps, who pretty much just played fine against Rookie, who was very much the better player at this point in time. Every Fnatic player ended up outplaying their opponent massively in at least one of those two games. The conclusion people draw from this group was Fnatic looking like contenders, poised to go to finals or maybe win the whole tournament, and IG just a tad worse than them, or maybe just less consistent. People weren't quite sure about that yet, but they definitely still were a force to be reckoned with. After that final day of Worlds group stage in Busan, the quarterfinals would also be happening in Busan, but I didn't manage to get any tickets for that. After that final day of groups, we as the European fans went out to KBBQ and have a few drinks. We met people such as Shocks and Travis Gafford and Mark Z, who I thought could never leave his house as he looks like a vampire, but actually went outside that day. And it was just such a great feeling because the Western teams at this tournament had performed so above expectations, and we as fans going out and actually meeting by chance those personalities from the West who were also just hyped up about the games, and on that final day just still so inspired from Fnatic's victory. It was such a great experience for all of us there, and already at this moment most of us felt that this was our World Championship for the taking. This was our one chance, our one shot to make something of this tournament. The playoff bracket draw actually happened on that last day of the group stage. Still in the arena, I watched it, and while the draw unfolded, I could already tell it was going to be 3 finals for Fnatic. I told that to my friends who I had met at the event, and it was Fnatic on one side of the bracket with 3 teams that they should clearly be better than. Of course, there still was a Freak of Freaks, who were a Korean team after all, but people, even those who weren't analysts or had a great mind about the game, could tell that Fnatic should be better than them. On the other side of the bracket, there were the 3 of the 4 best teams of the tournament pitted up against each other. It was RNG, it was IG, and it was KT, who all looked like contenders. And this was great news actually for Europe or for the West, because sure, G2 was on their side of the bracket and was almost surely not gonna do anything, but those 3 teams who would have to defeat each other, and only one of them would end up facing Fnatic in the finals. So people thought one more best of 5, one more tough best of 5 on Fnatic would be the world champions at this point in time. It was 3 matchups for Western teams versus Eastern teams, and 1 time East versus East. And if you look at past World Championship quarterfinals draws, this is actually nothing special. At this point in time, the tournament still looked like a regular World Championship that just went a little better for EU than expected. Only Fnatic was actually expected to advance at this point in time, and only RNG was expected to advance from China, which meant that if everything went according to plan, it would still be 2 Koreans in the semifinals, 1 European team, 1 Chinese team, and those 2 teams that were non-Koreans were the ones who were considered the best and outliers before the tournament. So still at this point in time, it was very much a usual World Championship in terms of the field. It was just 2 especially good teams from outside of Korea mixed in with 2 Korean teams in the semis, as pretty much every World Championship had been before that. Moving into the quarterfinals, all 3 Western teams beat their Asian counterpart. This is what sets this World Championship tournament apart from any other one. All 3 Western teams beat their Asian counterpart in a best of 5. The first day is, in my opinion, the best day in World's history. The most hyped day, most certainly for a Western fan. with two historic best of 5 upsets in there. IG and G2 upsetting their opponents. G2 at this point in time was considered to have pulled off the biggest upset ever, by the fans at least, and they just wouldn't back down against the best team in the tournament, supposedly, and they ended up taking them down, although there were people in the community, such as Kelsey Moser, I believe, who suggested that G2 very much had a chance in this matchup due to stylistic differences, and she had in fact noticed that the solo lanes dominating was emerging as the dominant trend of the tournament, and this was really not RNG's style. Their top laner had slacked at the tournament so far, and the mid laner surely was nothing special. Ledme and Yahoo were good players, but not on the level of Wonder and Perks on the G2 side, and this ended up breaking RNG's back in this best of 5. So credit to Kelsey Moser, I believe it was there. She had spot-on analysis of the best of 5, and they actually took them down. IG, of course, also with a massive upset over KT. At this point in time, you have to remember it was the super team from Korea who had looked immaculate in the group stage, and IG was only the second seed from China. So them beating the Korean team was pretty much already game over for Korea at this point in the tournament. And again, it was a tournament held in Korea. The Korean fans witnessing this upset from IG, they could literally not believe what unfolded in front of their eyes. Sure, it was a close series, but at this point in time it became exceedingly clear that Korea would not win this World Championship, which is the first World Championship they would not win in like 6 years. So now the Korean mega team of KT Rolster, with all the legendary players, and RNG are out. Those two teams were ranked 1 and 2 before the tournament by most analysts. And this is what really made this Worlds unprecedented. This is what sets it apart from all the other tournaments. The best two teams of the tournament out in quarterfinals. This is what broke the tournament. This single day made or broke the tournament, depending from what side of history you're watching it. The next day, the other two quarterfinals, 3-0 upset for Cloud9 over Freak of Freaks, which is just as much of an upset as those two beforehand. We got 3 straight upsets in the quarterfinals, eliminating Korea for the first time ever before the finals. And this taking place in Korea was an unbelievable experience for the Korean fans. They were very supportive of the Western teams, of other teams, so I really give them credit for not reacting badly to this situation. They were not at all hostile to the foreign fans, and I ended up making a few good friends actually while attending those matches in Korea. But the situation was just unheard of at this point in time. The last quarterfinal, Fnatic took care of ADG, not looking as strong as you would have hoped for Fnatic to look against the third seed of China, but still, it was not a close best of 5. The conclusion from those quarterfinals was Korea was out of the tournament. China's hope hinged on IG, which were the last team from them, and we had 2 European teams and C9 from North America still remaining in the tournament. At this point, the West looked poised to take it all. It was 3 Western teams against 1 Asian team. And remember, Fnatic were the best team of those 4 teams, ranked before the tournament, and also had beaten IG twice in groups. So the fans from the West surely believed the West should win it all at this point. The analysts were a bit more tame about it, but they also were very well aware of a real possibility existing for the Western teams to actually take it this time around. To experts, IG and Fnatic of course were the heavy favorites. Nobody believed that G2 or Cloud9 could win the tournament, even if G2 managed to upset IG again. They had proven to be a decisively weaker team than Fnatic in the regional play, so they were not going to win this event. For fans, on the other hand, it was 50-50 at this point, due to the nature of the upsets being difficult to assess if you're not actually a person who understands the game on a deeper level. If you can't actually tell why G2 was favored over RNG stylistically very much, and not at all against IG, who just had better solo lanes in Rookie and the Shy. So for fans, it felt like any team could take it at this point. Around came the semifinals, and the first matchup was IG just slapping G2, making day 2 the most important day in the European NA modern history. It was literally EU versus NA for one spot in the final against an Asian team who had looked great in the playoffs. But it was this moment that defined the modern history between those two Western regions. At this point in time, had NA won that match, they very much could have been considered the second best region at the point in time, just as Europe had been after the tournament. Whoever wins is the first Western region to make it to finals at Worlds ever. Fnatic had been considered a tournament favorite and had impressed in groups, but hadn't looked great in quarterfinals, while C9 had struggled in play-ins, but then impressed in groups and stomped the Korean representatives in the quarterfinals. So many fans thought it could actually go either way in this matchup. I myself, as a European fan who didn't know a lot about how the game actually worked at this point in time, I very much had fear of Cloud9 taking this, and not because I didn't like Cloud9 or anything. I like most of their players, in fact, but I just couldn't give NA that triumph of making finals before Europe, and I was sure that Europe had to be the better region. But I was very much scared of Fnatic actually losing the best of 5 after how Cloud9 looked in the quarterfinals, and I surely wasn't the only Western fan to think like that. It was truly like the life is on the line for those two Western regions, and it was a life and death match at this point. Fnatic, of course, proceeded to curb stomp Cloud9 to no avail. It was brutal. It was not pretty to watch. I watched it with my Korean friends, and yeah, it was just funny. After the first game, it was just funny. It was 2-3-0 Ruffle Stomps in the semifinals, and this was, in hindsight, not a huge surprise. For the people at the time, it felt bad. It felt surprising, maybe, because some people thought, oh, G2 beat the best team from China. Of course they can beat the second best team. Other people thought, okay, Cloud9 beat the Koreans. They eliminated Korea from the tournament. They surely have a chance against EU. But if you look back at the tournament, and this is the one thing that always follows after upsets, is a total stomp. Because if a team isn't really better than the team they beat, but they only upset them, then in the next stage of the tournament, it will only get harder for them, and they will only face better teams than the ones they eliminated. Therefore, they most likely will just get slapped, and this is what ended up happening here. 2-3-0 Storms with no chance that the other team could have won those best of 5s in hindsight. Before finals, now this point is what I want to focus most of the attention on. The analyst and expert opinions beforehand were heavily polarized. Fnatic had won out by the end of the group stage, but IG had looked much better in the playoffs and frankly unstoppable, slapping G2 and also beating the best team, KD Roaster, in the quarterfinals, which meant that many analysts actually gave IG the favorite role before this finals, but it was by no means clear-cut. This point in time has been very much retconned. The week before the finals, it was absolutely a 50-50 situation. Fnatic absolutely was considered to have a chance by both community and analysts. Many men thought they could actually do something in this matchup. I like to compare this situation to 2013 Season 3 World Finals, where RNG was getting troll votes from the analyst desk. This time around, people actually thought that Fnatic might take this one, since they had beaten IG in groups with their new roster with Bwipo playing instead of Soas, and they had looked as dominant in the playoff bracket, but they also had just played worse teams in the playoff bracket. Therefore, many people argued you couldn't really tell how strong they were just from their matchups against EDG and Cloud9. So I can't emphasize this enough. It was absolutely a situation where both teams were considered to be able to win this final, and it was not at all lost before they even played, at least not in the community's eyes. Now, what ended up happening was Fnatic players who had outperformed their counterparts on the last day of groups, as I mentioned earlier, ended up getting outperformed in 1v1 situations. Broxah and Bwipo especially were absolutely lost at different points in the series, and Cap still couldn't find advantages against Rookie. Therefore, Fnatic just broke down and was a quick 3-0. Afterwards, many people went on to state that Fnatic couldn't have had a chance in this series, but it was a single best of 5 series, and they have proven they could beat this team before when it matters. So of course Fnatic could have won Worlds in this point in time. Looking back at the event, this was the best chance the West was ever gonna get. Now this is not supposed to mean that West can never win Worlds, but it's gonna be very much harder going forward, with Korea now having re-established themselves as a competent region who can actually contest for the title or is even favored to win it, and China now having almost a dozen teams who look better than most teams in all the Western region. Therefore, the field is never going to get as easy as it was at this point in time for the West to win the World Championship. And this was the one real opportunity for us to win it, but also it showed to all the players in the European servers that it was possible, if you went to the highest level, to actually become the best player in the world, not just your region, to actually be part of the best team in the world, not just smashing your local competition. This was very much the get rich or die trying of the League of Legends modern history.